This week on Wealth Track, best-selling author and historian Neil Ferguson on what the past tells us about our future after the seismic global economic and market shifts of recent years. The lessons of history are next on Consuelo Mack Wealth Track. He is the author of several bestsellers, including his most recent, The Ascent of Money, The War of the World, and Colossus, The Rise and Fall of the American Empire, all of which have been turned into PBS specials. Ferguson is also a prolific commentator on contemporary politics and economics, and a professor at both Harvard University and its business school, and a senior fellow at Oxford and Stanford's Hoover Institute. I asked Ferguson for his view of the state of the U.S. economy, which is recovering from what he called the Great Repression.
The U.S. economy is on pretty powerful medication, in fact. The only reason that there was any growth in the third quarter of 2009 is massive monetary and fiscal stimulus pumped into the patient's veins to keep the economy from contracting. So one can only say that the Great Repression it's developing. The patient is coming out of the worst of the medical condition. But when you look at the way that some people behave, whether on Wall Street or on Main Street, when you look at the behavior of some banks, when you look at the behavior of some households, you have to conclude that they're still in denial, for example, about the scale of their debts. And I think when I hear people saying, this is a V-shaped recovery, when I hear them say, the recession is over, our problems are behind us, I think, my God, the Great Repression goes on. It's not over.
Let me ask you about the size of our debts. And you're not only referring to the personal debts, the consumer debts, which are huge, but also the government debts, which are just exploding exponentially. So how concerned are you about the indebtedness of the United States?
Very. If you look at a very simple measure, which is debt to gross domestic product, and add together the public and private debt, financial sector, household sector, corporate sector, and government, you end up with a figure of 350%. In other words, our debt is 3.5 times our national output. Right now, the interest rates that we pay on all of this debt are relatively low. The scary thing is to imagine what it would be like if those interest rates were to creep up. And that's my big concern, that we go from a crisis of private finance, of private debt, straight into a crisis of public debt.
What happens when countries are this indebted? I mean, what are we headed for unless something radically changes?
I think one of the lessons of the history of great powers, if you don't like the word empire, which some Americans don't, let's just talk about great powers, suggests that excessive debt is very often the prelude to decline. That was true of Habsburg Spain. It was certainly true of Britain's empire. It was true of the Ottoman Empire, which you mentioned. And what's particularly alarming is when an empire becomes heavily reliant on foreign capital. Now, the US federal debt is already half owned abroad. That's just around 50% of the federal debt, which is in foreign hands, which includes China, right? So we actually have a very substantial chunk of that debt held by what is likely to be our principal strategic rival in the 21st century, the People's Republic of China. It's hard to see that as a good geopolitical scenario for the United States. Crises of public finance tend to end in one of two ways. If the debt is in somebody else's currency, you will probably default on it at some point. This is the Latin American phenomenon, but it's by no means only Latin America. Many European countries defaulted on foreign currency debts in the mid-20th century. If the debt's in your own currency, you have another option, and this is the case that the United States finds itself in. It's borrowed in dollars. You can debauch the currency, depreciate the currency, and inflate the debt away if you're quick. If you can surprise the debtors with a really quite rapid depreciation in the purchasing power of your currency. I think most people looking at the situation of the United States today would say that second scenario is more likely, because it's hard to imagine the US defaulting. It isn't Argentina, at least not yet. But, you know, the problem is it's quite hard to catch people out in the early 21st century with a sudden increase in the price level or a sudden depreciation of the dollar. Investors aren't stupid. They know that this is a major risk for anybody holding a large quantity of dollar-denominated debt. So I think the really fascinating question for 2010 is going to be, how does this play out? At what point do the markets say, wait a second, this is an unsustainable fiscal policy. We need to be compensated more for lending money to the federal government of the United States. In other words, the bond prices need to come down and the yield, the interest on the debt needs to go up. I can't help feeling the markets are going to start asking for some compensation, if only for the currency risk, even in a world of very low inflation.
So put the era that we're going through into perspective for us. It has been enough to cause people to despair, lose fortunes, think that nothing like this has happened before.
I think we're living through something not entirely unlike the aftermath of 1873. Contemporaries called it the Great Depression. They didn't know that a really, really Great Depression was coming in the 1930s. And we're going through something like that. It's not as cataclysmic as 1929 to 33. But it is a little bit reminiscent of the post-1873 period in which the world was in a deflationary mode for a long time. I mean, prices flatlined, they even declined over 20 years. At the same time, there was a big shift of production from one region of the world to the other. Only now it's China that's playing the role that the United States played in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. And we've got populism. We've got the beginnings of a really big backlash against the political establishments that, frankly, were to blame for this crisis. We don't yet know what form that will take. We don't yet know if the Republican Party is going to split in two with a far-right party that can no longer do business with moderates. We don't know if former Governor Sarah Palin is going to pull off one of these great maverick political campaigns that have been a feature of American political life for many, many years. What we do know is that we're going to see something that we have seen before. History doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. But for me, the best guide to what lies ahead lies back in the late 19th century, which was also a time of great power rivalry, a time when no one power could really be said to be a hyperpower. It was a great power rivalry that ultimately produced a massive war and the end of globalization. My hope is that we can learn enough from history to avoid repeating that fatal mistake.